Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to learn with this community today at making uncomfortable conversations a habit, a New Year's resolution. I'm Samantha Weil. I'm SRE Network's community manager, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to learn with you today. For those of you who are new to SRE Network, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you join us for this learning session. SRE Network is a Jewish network of 160 plus organizations rooted in a shared commitment to safety, respect, and equity for all. We inspire meaningful change in workplaces and communal spaces by bringing people together to address gender-based harassment, discrimination, and inequity through an intersectional lens of gender justice. Our work is focused on community investments, research and learning, and community building. In this session and the next hour, we will explore why conversations about sexual harassment and violence are important and how these conversations work to prevent and respond to these behaviors. We'll address how individuals can have these uncomfortable conversations and the framework that can help them do so. We'll also cover what managers need to know to have these conversations. We are so excited to learn from the expertise of Sarah Pierson today. Sarah is the author of Breaking the Silence Habit, a practical guide to uncomfortable conversations in the Me Too workplace. She's a speaker and consultant who trains workplaces and managers on skill-based sexual harassment prevention and respond. So just a couple logistics notes before I turn it over to Sarah and we jump in. If you need closed captions today, you can click the CC button and it will pop up on your screen. I also want to share our community norm that what's said here stays here and what's learned here leaves here. That way we can create a brave space to learn together. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Sarah. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to chat with all of you. I think we're a small group. I'm going to add just a little bit of some additional caveats. So one is that we are going to talk about sexual violence prevention and response today. I am a survivor of sexual abuse. I'm going to share a tiny bit about my story for some people that, if that's triggering, you can turn off your video, you can leave. I think, again, this isn't a talk that's really designed for survivors, but certainly keep survivors in mind. But if you are somebody who's experienced sexual harassment or violence and you've gotten here and you've decided that like today is not the day for me to be a part of a conversation like this, like you can leave, my feelings will not be hurt. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. No pressure to share anything you don't want to share, to participate. We will do small breakout rooms at the end of the session. It's really about like what commitments are you making to have conversations in your community about sexual violence. So sort of, again, you can share what you want. You don't have to share anything at all. But what we're going to talk about, and I think the other thing that I would say is that if you're somebody who's really skilled, experienced, and an advocate in these kinds of conversations, the thing that I hope you're listening for today is this idea of like, how do you engage more people in them so that it doesn't always have to be you? And so how do we kind of grow the team of people who are comfortable having these kinds of conversations? And if you are new to these kinds of conversations or early on your learning pathway, this is a day for you too. And so, I think what I'm planning to do is to give you like as condensed as possible without speaking too fast summary of the book that I wrote, Breaking the Silence Habit. I want to walk you through that book and then give you an opportunity to think about how those conversations might come to life in your life. So with that, Julian, we can kind of kick off. So where I want to start is actually just sort of some context around kind of why I wrote the book and who I wrote the book for. And so as we're kind of thinking about this like new year, same challenge is we are unfortunately still in a world where there is pervasive sexual harassment of rates of 25% to 85% in workplaces. We're still looking at vast underreporting of sexual harassment for sort of very good reasons. We've also, I think, sort of seen and experienced in some ways, how, particularly now that we're more than 5 years into the Me Too movement, is that, well, the Me Too movement created in some ways, many more opportunities to talk about sexual violence in terms of the volume up on the topic of sexual harassment and sexual violence. Is that to some extent, it's also made it harder to talk about, and sometimes harder to develop the skills. It's like people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, or afraid of exposing an attitude or a misperception, or when are we going to call out a behavior? When are we not going to call out a behavior? And so when we think about people who are concerned that sexual harassment will continue to go unchecked, there's other people that are concerned that people are getting fired up without the facts. And so what all of this does is that it creates, when you open the door to a conversation about sexual harassment prevention and response, it feels like a volatile conversation. So we can go on to the next slide. So that's a little bit of the background. But if we think about what is the future that we want, right? So when I think about the future workplace that I want, it would be a place where we can talk about workplace relationships, behavior, and boundaries in new ways. It's a place where power is something that can be seen and discussed openly. It's a place where we can give and receive feedback and not completely freak out about it. It's a place where people look out for each other and share some of the responsibility, not just for the work that they do, but how they do it together. So when we think about this future world and the pathway that we're going to need to get there, there's two things, at least for me, that come into focus. So one is that a new culture is going to require us to develop new skills. Culture is conversation. So every conversation that we have is going to lead us to the culture that we want to have in the future. And that none of these skills can be learned in a 60-minute workshop. So I'm going to do my best, but we're not going to leave today with all of the skills that we need in order to fully live into the future. But going on to the next slide. So the other just kind of framing piece that I think is important is I'll give you the metaphor of soccer, right? So if you walked onto a soccer team or a soccer field, so a group of people that you've committed to doing something together, right? Which is similar to what a workplace is that if you showed up and that all you were told was, here are the rules, like it's, the rules are, here are the rules of soccer, here's the lines, here's the boundary, here's the goal, here's how the scoring works. That's not the same as learning the skills that you need to play the game. And so rules are top down, but if you think about the skills that you need to play soccer, is like you need to be able to run, you need to be able to run and kick a ball at the same time, you need to be able to run around people, and that some people are going to be showing up with a different range of skills, and that's okay. It doesn't mean, once you know the rules, then you can start to think about what skills do we need in order to follow those rules and to play the game together. And so today is really about about encouraging all of us to think about how do we need to skill ourselves up? How can we show up in a way to skill up the people around us? So that's essentially, so we can go on to the next slide, is that's essentially what the book lays out. So the book lays out a way to think about sexual harassment prevention that is skills-based rather than rules-based. So I'm going to give you the overview, and then we're going to take each of these a little one step at a time. So one is you start with the rules, but you don't end there. And so rules are important because rules tell you, help you hold people accountable. But if you begin and end with the rules, then you're going to have basically like a soccer team that is, doesn't know how to play the game. Two is this idea of assessing experience in uncomfortable conversations. And so that's assessing and looking at your own experience, as well as thinking about the experience or the difference in experience of those around you. Three is take on a framework. So the framework that we're going to talk briefly about today we go into more depth in the book, but it's have a framework, because if you don't have a framework, then you're going to leverage a framework that might not be helpful for the conversation. Four is, like with any skill, you have to practice it, and you have to practice it quite a bit. And then five is this idea of habit formation. And so that's really where we're going to end today, with this idea of a habit. You develop habits by doing things repeatedly and by committing to them until it becomes something that is just natural. And so when we think about a habit of uncomfortable conversation, the habit we're trying to break is the habit of silence. So the habit of saying nothing when you are faced with something that is uncomfortable. So we can go briefly to the next slide. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about me and kind of how I come to this work. through the lens of conversation. So my first conversation about sexual violence, it took place when I was 11 years old. It was a night on a family trip to Oregon that I told my mom that a family member was abusing me. And in that moment, my mom did something that was just really right, is she believed me. And as powerful as that conversation was, both for me and my family, it didn't undo the damage of sexual abuse, either for me, for my family. It didn't solve the healing pathway. I think, like many survivors, I went on to deal with many of the mental health impacts of sexual abuse and unlike many survivors, I did eventually find the support that I needed to heal. And all of those were conversations as well. And so if I think about kind of conversation by conversation, my pathway to healing from this experience really unfolded. And it wasn't just, and while I had an amazing therapist who I actually dedicated the book to, she was one person who played a really important role, but another relationship that really helped shape both my healing and the perspective that I bring to some of this work is my very best friend, Russ. We became friends in the hallway of a dormitory on the campus of Brown University when he found me in the stairwell crying, and rather than avoiding, what to me at the time felt like kind of my big messy trauma, he dug in, and he's 25 years later, here we are still digging in, and we've actually started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping others do the same. And so, Russ taught me really to see conversations not just as breaking silence about trauma or about healing, but really conversations as tools for allies and friends and helpers. And he helped me realize, additionally, that men might come to these conversations with different perspectives than people of other genders. So if I think about my personal experience as a survivor, along with my friendship, with Russ, it really ignited this passion to help survivors and to help other survivors, but also to help the people who want to help them but don't know how. And so every conversation that I can spark, or that you can spark with a friend, a date, a colleague, a boss, or a stranger, is it sort of lays down this stone on a pathway to healing that we can all sort of walk down as a community and as a society. And so, my passion for inspiring and having these conversations is kind of grounded in both this obsessive optimism about humans in the world, but also just wanting to listen and learn, and really feeling like I have this obligation. I was lucky to find the help and healing that I needed, and I feel an obligation to kind of pay that forward. So, I've learned kind of quite a bit through many, through interview. There are about 100 interviews that informed this book. There's research on sexual violence prevention and response, as well as some of the existing approaches to sexual harassment prevention, and doing a lot of conversations in workplaces on this topic. But I think, when I think about sort of the central message that I hope you walk away with is that uncomfortable conversations are worth having because the price of avoiding them is really high. And an uncomfortable conversation, it is an activity that all of us can do, but it's also a skill that we can get better at over time and master it if we're interested in doing so. So being skilled at having uncomfortable conversations, it is a way of being in the world. And it's also a cornerstone habit of healthy people and relationships and cultures. And so that's, a little bit of just the kind of perspective that I'm bringing about in my my conversation history. So we can actually, for a moment, Julian, maybe we can bring down the slide. Again, no pressure to come on video. If you're comfortable using emojis or reactions, we can do that. But so what I want to do is just do a little bit of an exercise, and so we could do show of hands, we can do emojis, whatever you feel comfortable with. Or if you don't want to share, you don't have to, but essentially I'm going to walk you through what I typically do as a conversation assessment in a room. And so the exercise is both a self-reflection, but it's also to really understand how different people come to this topic with different types of experiences that we can really bring in as skills, right? So you might have somebody who's got really great ball skills. You might have someone who's a really fast runner, a really great goalie. And so it's kind of thinking about it with this lens. So how many have had a conversation about consent, healthy relationships, or appropriate workplace behavior with your parents or the people who raised you? So thinking about that. All right. How many have had a conversation on the same set of topics with either your own children or young people whose lives you feel responsible for in some way? Sometimes I feel like I should throw pets in there, but I have not yet done that. But I can have a conversation with your pet if you would like to. How many of you have had supportive conversations with survivors who identify as female? How many of you have had supportive conversations with survivors who identify as male or transgender? How many of you have had some practice addressing somebody else's troubling words or behavior that might constitute sexual harassment or misconduct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Did you say addressing or dressing?
Addressing someone else's troubling words or behavior. So an intervention conversation. Great, lots of hands raises. How many of you have taken accountability for your own mistakes in workplace relationships, boundaries, or inappropriate behavior? Like, oops, put my foot in my mouth and now I need to take it out or apologize for the impact of something I said. And how many of you have participated in more than 1 hour of sexual harassment training that goes beyond compliance? So great, everyone will be able to raise their hand after today. How many have participated in more than 5 hours or more than 10 hours? All right, we can go back to the slide. So the point in doing that, right, is that, so one is this particular group of people, right? So people who will voluntarily sign up for a session on uncomfortable conversations in the Me Too workplace is a little bit of a self-selecting group. But I think when we're talking about workplaces, is that you are typically dealing with people. We could go to the 2 more slides ahead of us. You're typically going to a group of people where there's some real diversity and experience. And so while some people may have had lots and lots of conversations growing up or with their kids, and other people have not. And so the point is that when you're walking into a room and normalizing and understanding differences in experience, you can create an organization that can get a little bit smarter about how to build skills across teams and departments. And then also that, like, you're not surprised when you encounter somebody who might still be on a learning pathway for this. So going to the next slide. So we've already covered the first 2 pieces so again, I'm going to move you so quickly through this book, and I hope you still will read it at the end, but I'm going to give you a really fast summary of the book. So 1, start with compliance, but don't end there. 2, assess experience in uncomfortable conversations. So now I'm going to tell you I want to tell you kind of a quick example of an uncomfortable conversation that I opened the book with, which I actually was reflecting on, because this is a story. My son is the son that Lucas, who I'll tell you the story about. This is a story from when he was 7. He's now 11, and I can actually really think about how this story sort of set us off on a pathway of being able to engage in some of these conversations. So when my son was 7, so Nancy, if there's a question, we can. I think Gila is handling questions. So my son, he leans over to me and he asks me, again, you have to imagine he's 7 years old. So he asks me if he could Google something on my phone, right? And so what I said to him is like, well, what do you need to Google? And he's like, well, I need you to not change your face when I tell you. So I'm thinking to myself, okay. So he leans over, he whispers in my ear, naked girls. So I was a little bit confused, because I said to him, he's a sister. So I said, well, you've seen your sister naked. Like, what do you want exactly? Like, what are you trying to see? And so he says, well, I just wanted to see a lot of them. So you can go on to the next 2 slides here. So I'm, frankly, like, he's my oldest. I was stunned by this conversation. So I head over to my favorite sex ed site, which is called amaze.org, and I found some age-appropriate animated videos. We watch the videos, and then he watches them very intently, and then he says, well, I want to see pictures of naked girls. So I'm thinking to myself, like, what is he talking about? Like, are we talking about pornography? I don't think so, because he's only 7. So I'm kind of searching for a new angle. And so since he's pretty private about his body, I just asked him if he'd want other people to find a photo of him on the internet. And he said, so he said, no, I would not. And so then he kind of agrees that maybe the internet is not a good place for those photos. And so, and we could go on to the next slide because amaze.org is a really great organization. And then we give them a shout out here. So yeah, in that moment, I remember feeling so proud of him. One, both for being curious, and I let him know that. And two is, just, it opened up this door for the conversation about like, look, there's a lot of bad and wrong information on the internet about bodies and sex. And if you Google something like naked girls, like you might not get the right answer. And so that actually then started another thread of conversation because, this is a kid who just doesn't want to be dumb about anything. Like he wants to have the facts straight, and whether it's Pokemon or the running speed of a cheetah, like, I mean, now he's very much into history and still into facts. But so, kind of wrap up this conversation by telling him that, that as he grows up, like people are going to come to him with probably bad and wrong information, and they might share it with him. And that if and when that happens, I want him to be able to come back to me. So I'm sharing this as an example of what an uncomfortable conversation is, and also as a way to illustrate the benefits of uncomfortable conversations. And so in the case of my son, the conversation benefited our relationship is that this was the first time that I remember kind of just breaking the ice with him on a topic like this and on a topic at least related to internet safety. And we had other conversations about bodies and boundaries, but it helped to establish this trust and confidence that we could talk about uncomfortable things again. I also think about the fact that this is a conversation that benefits others, right? So when I share this conversation frequently. It's in the book. I talk about it quite a bit. And I think about the idea that I've given other people a reference point for a similar conversation. And hopefully if you have an opportunity to have this conversation with a child, you'll do better than I did. So we can all learn from this together. And then three, I think about the impact of the conversation that I had with him on his peer group. So his friends, and then his friends' parents to some extent. So now what we know is that in my son's peer group, there is somebody who is prepared to have this conversation, to correct misinformation, to sort of like bring the cultural conversation forward. So if I had been too uncomfortable to engage in the conversation, or if I had leaned into a habit of silence, or it's like, oh gosh, like, no, of course you can't look up naked girls, end of conversation. There's so much that we would have missed out on, right? Is that, and there's lots of reasons why we might shut it down. Like I might've been afraid to say the wrong thing. I might've been afraid that I'm going to make it worse, or it's like, but when we engage in these kinds of conversations, is that there's benefits for our individual, there's benefits for relationships, there's benefits for communities, and there's kind of ways to pay it forward. So that's a little bit of the background on uncomfortable conversation. So one thing as we go to the next slide is to just think about and reflect on, right, is that, are there, if you're drawing from other experiences and skills that you've developed in your life, think about other types of uncomfortable things that you've done that have added value, in your life. One thing that always comes to mind for me is pictured here is running, right? And so, thinking about the difference between discomfort and pain is that most new things that we take on feel uncomfortable in some way, but it doesn't, that discomfort isn't a sign that we're doing them wrong. It's actually a sign sometimes that we're doing them right. So going on to the next slide is getting to this idea of a framework, right? So I'm going to just very briefly talk about this framework, but let me tell you why a framework is important. So when we don't have a framework for engaging in these kinds of conversations, and again, what we're not talking about, when we talk about uncomfortable conversations, hopefully that sort of story helped illustrate, is that we're not talking about conversations that themselves constitute sexual harassment. So we're not talking about personally experienced sexual harassment and like what you should or should not say. Or what the people around you should or should not say. That's actually a very specific kind of uncomfortable conversation that falls under bystander intervention, which we'll talk a little bit about today. So this is kind of just any conversation that creates a world or a workplace that we're supporting healthy boundaries, safety and respect, and that sort of thing. But when we don't have a framework, what ends up happening is that we bring other frameworks to the conversation. So let me remind you what some other frameworks that we all like to use, like the framework of right and wrong, or the framework of good and bad, or sometimes the framework of teacher and student, which isn't always a helpful framework for these kinds of conversations. So if you're bringing like an uncomfortable conversation framework, like what do I mean by that? So what's one is this idea of knowing the facts. And really what that means is being open to both learning and sharing facts in a conversation and applying those facts appropriately. So it's not necessarily convincing somebody of the right set of facts, but it's really like setting the table for like, what facts are we kind of like all working with here? And so when it comes to sexual harassment prevention response, it's like sometimes there's a lot of myths and misperceptions. You might be thinking about different facts. You might be thinking about the facts in different ways. With my son is that if I had fixated on this fact of pornography, like I might have got like sort of missed out on the wanting to learn facts about bodies, right? So again, it's just sort of like, what's the kind of, what table are we setting here? And so in the workplace, another example of that, right, is that it can be surprising to learn that sexual harassment isn't reported if you don't first understand what makes it hard to report, right? And so it's, so making sure that we're kind of just all dealing with that. So the second is this idea of just accepting discomfort as part of the conversation. And so it is, I've been doing these conversations for so long. I'm uncomfortable every time. I'm very uncomfortable when I come in and talk to a group. Like I'm uncomfortable right now, but it doesn't mean that I'm not going to just continue to have the conversation, because what I know is that the discomfort that I am experiencing is worth it in service of the future that we can imagine together. And so, and I think I've also done my own work to recognize sort of, again, you have to recognize the difference between discomfort and pain, but knowing where your discomfort comes from and also where somebody else's discomfort might come from. And it may not be from the same place, right? And so, so then what you want to be able to do is then figuring out kind of how do you develop a strategy to move through the conversation instead of shutting it down, right? So if we just sort of walk away from something that makes us uncomfortable and we don't do it, then we sort of have to continue to live in a society or go to a workplace where, where things continue that we don't want them to continue. So third is this tool around just pausing a reaction, right? So it's, so again, when you think about, we're not always operating from the same facts, we're kind of bringing different levels of discomfort for different reasons to the conversation, but then and that's going to create a place where like it's hard to get through an uncomfortable conversation without some kind of emotional reaction. So thinking about how we kind of pause that reaction and remember our purpose in the conversation is a really important tool. And again, I'm not talking about conversations when sort of like harassment or abuse or assault is taking place. That's like we're talking about different kinds of conversations. Like if you're in a conversation about why is sexual harassment policy important in my workplace, those conversations can get very emotionally charged. And so if we're kind of, but if the purpose of having the conversation, is it to educate? Is it to understand? Is it to sort of like move through discomfort together? Is that, if you have the skill in pausing your reaction, then you actually might have an opportunity to work through somebody else's reaction too. So it's like sort of thinking about just like, again, it doesn't mean you don't have the reaction or you don't do something with it. It just means you like take a pause and then think about, sort of why am I here and how do I move forward? And then there's this idea of just kind of seeing the whole picture, right? Is that, a single conversation that you're having, it's, whether you're having it with the, the workplace, you can get into a conversation and somebody can say something and then it's like, you're not understanding each other. And then you like draw these kind of like big picture conclusions sort of like about what's happening. And so, one of the ways that I actually, one of the common places that I've seen this show up is in some of the kind of intersectional conversations just across race and gender. And so like what I've noticed or observed, at least and experienced in myself personally, is that as a woman, I understand deeply and intuitively like what it feels like to be afraid, right? So like what it feels like to be afraid walking down a street at night, what it feels like to be afraid of, of somebody's anger or somebody's body size, right? What I don't know, or sort of like, and what I have not internalized is what does it feel like to be feared? And that is like, that there are people that walk through their lives having people fear them because of their race, because of their gender, right? And that fear and that sort of experience of being feared shows up in some of these conversations too. And so when I say see the whole picture, is that sort of we're all bringing identities that we, that we did not choose to have, that sort of have been given to us, and we're bringing those into conversations. And how do we just do that as skillfully as possible, right? And so again, it's just kind of backing up. And then finally, like one tool to doing that is to just embrace this idea of practical questions, right? So, so asking questions is sometimes a better strategy than lecturing somebody if you want to like learn or convey facts. So just kind of like asking questions. Asking questions can kind of help you move through discomfort. It can help you unpack a reaction. It can help you see a conversation or a topic from another perspective. So that's kind of just a little bit of just the, that kind of uncomfortable conversation framework, which if we go to the next slide, is sort of step 3 of this idea of skills-based sexual harassment prevention and response. And so
I hope everyone's doing well this afternoon.
Great, welcome. And so finally, so what I want to talk about now is I want to sort of bring all of these pieces together. Okay. And so, and then we're going to kind of wrap up and move into some questions and answer. We'll take some questions, and then we're going to do some breakout sessions on kind of putting this into practice yourself. So if you go to the next slide, okay, so this is what I do with organizations. So what we're going to do now is like, so this is what I do with organizations. This is one of probably 24 examples that we have in the book, because like, as you might imagine, I'm all about practice, right? So it's like, here are the skills. You don't get better at these skills unless you practice them. So how do you practice them? You have to have conversations, because listening to me have a conversation about something without doing it yourself is like not going to be the same thing as you doing it, right? Like, here, watch me run. Practice makes progress. Exactly. Like, watch me run across the soccer field is not the same as running across the soccer field yourself. So, all right. So the way that so this is what we do. So this is like the type of scenario, like how we tee up an uncomfortable conversation. So it's like thinking about in advance some kind of scenario. And again, these scenarios are like, that does not take a lot of creativity to come up with them, right? Like they sort of all fall into like several different kinds of categories. So the one that so I've used this scenario in like lots of different environments, right? So you share this scenario. So I can read it to folks, but it's like, Ray walks by a mixed gender group of employees laughing at something on the screen. As Ray gets closer, he sees they're watching a YouTube video of naked mud wrestling. What might Ray do next, right? So there is amazing power in teeing this scenario up in a group of people where they have really diverse ranges of experiences in these kinds of conversations. And you say, what might Ray do next? Again, I'm not saying what should Ray do next. I'm saying what might Ray do next? And so what might Ray do next? Ray could do nothing, okay? Ray could intervene either in the moment or after the fact. Ray could report the situation to a manager, or Ray could not report the situation to a manager, right? So all of those responses, depending on the person and context, are completely reasonable responses. But what happens is you share those responses, and then you ask a practical question. Oh, well, why might Ray do nothing? Oh, well, like Ray might do nothing because it's like, there's cultural issues, and like they were all his bosses. And so it's like, so you sort of start to get into somebody's head, or Ray might intervene. Oh, well, if Ray were going to intervene, what might Ray say? Who would he say it to? What would it sound like coming out of their mouth, right? So it's, so a lot of times when we're practicing bystander intervention scenarios, like the cool thing that happens is if you're doing bystander intervention, sort of like at the brown belt or black belt level, it's about how do you engage the community to restore safety? And so like understanding what characters people can play or might be willing to play, or what their voices sound like, lets you like pull in the right voices. So sometimes it's like, I might have something to say, but if I'm not going to be the most effective voice at restoring safety to a situation from a bystander lens, it really helps me to know like who else in the room might I be able to pull in, right? And so it's like, so by practicing these kinds of conversations. So that's kind of, so again, is this power of practice. So like, how do you introduce the idea of practice? How do you introduce the, the idea of practice kind of into your workplace on a very regular basis? Because the first time that, another place that will practice, if you go to the next slide, I can show you just all of the skills that you start to develop. So intervention, setting boundaries, respecting boundaries, giving feedback, managing conflict. One that's not on here is a disclosure conversation. So if somebody reports sexual harassment to you, one is like recognizing that somebody is reporting to you. Two is like, how do you handle that conversation? Three is, how is that conversation handled in the context of sort of like larger policies or procedures? I can't tell you how many people are surprised by the fact that you might have an obligated reporting, sort of policy within your organization, and there's like nothing worse than finding that out after you've actually disclosed something, right? Is that it's like, I thought we were having a conversation and now HR is involved. And so sort of when you think about, practicing those conversations preemptively, right, is that it's when you do this in an organization or in a team, it also starts to identify some of the landmines. So whether it's an obstacle to reporting, distrust of HR, policies that need clarification, skills that might be lagging. There's like a really fun scenario that I do about like setting and respecting boundaries that is like all about just like imperfect human communication, right? It's like, I'm keep inviting you out and you keep saying no, but like I'm inviting you to a group thing, but you don't know that. And so like, there's just sort of, there's like lots of ways that, that we have opportunities to build skills. So look at that, 38 minutes, not including introductions. And I've walked you through a book that took me 9 months to write. So I hope that as I always typically say during event is I live in Boston now, but I definitely speak with the speed of somebody who grew up in New Jersey. And so I really try to slow myself down. And sometimes it's a little harder to do that on Zoom when I'm not getting sort of just the same kind of interaction. So, all right, so I'm gonna, let's go to the next slide, because what I want to be clear is that there's like lots of, I think just recognizing that this is a mixed group of just sort of folks who might be bringing different perspectives. We can go one more slide, is this idea of kind of like how we're going to think about making it a habit, right? So you could be a manager of a team and managing a team. So there's kind of, ways that you can think about how to implement skills-based sexual harassment, sort of, whether or not your organization is investing in something like this. If you're an HR leader or the executive director of an organization, sort of thinking about how this might apply to your whole organization or to a whole group of a group or a community that you are leading is another way to think about this. But there's also ways to just think about kind of making it a habit as an individual or an individual contributor. So sort of like, how do I commit individually to learning new skills and sharing those skills with others that are in my life? Because I think, at the end of the day, it's like, that's what, like, the book is written for that whole group. So it's written for people leaders, for senior managers. It's written for, people who, I remember this one guy I met, he's the chief operating officer at a tech company. And like, we loved the concept of uncomfortable conversations, and he challenged himself to have 30 in 30 days. I loved that. I was like, that's great. And so, so I think if we can all just get like 10% better, or help the people around us get 10% better at having these kinds of conversations, it's like really adds up to a big community and cultural impact. So I'm going to pause there before I kind of move us into some breakout. We can take a few minutes if there's some burning questions, or we can kind of move right into a chance for all of you to talk to each other too. And I have not been in the chat, but I think we're gonna see what's happening. So if there are questions, you can unmute yourself and ask. If you don't want to talk, that is okay. I will just keep going. It's your, for those of you where it's your lunch hour, you just came here to listen, that's totally fine.
Sarah, I'll comment that I'm noticing in the chat, every time you share something that's very practical and doable, there's either not a lot of nodding, or the comments in the chat are like, that's amazing, because you're giving us, like, this is New Year's resolution, right? And you are giving us some very practical things that we can apply. And so I'm loving the action-oriented frame of this. And from what I'm seeing in the chat, I think others are also. So thank you for that.
Great. Well, excellent. Well, then let's like keep going, because like this is when it gets super practical. Okay. So, so Julian, why don't let's pull up slide 22 for, so if it's, I think it's 3 more ahead, and then I'm going to actually back up to kind of show the examples, which are also in the handouts. Okay. So, yep, 1 more. All right. So here's what we are going to do in small groups. Okay. And so again, share what you want. Really, the whole idea of breaking out into groups is like, it's an accountability practice, right? So it's like, so if you want to make a habit, you need to, so think about whether you're going to, do you want to leave this hour with a plan as an individual or as a manager? So that's your sort of like step 1. Okay. Step 2 is make a plan. And so Samantha is sharing the references that we shared ahead of time. So there's a template, and then there's another document that has the examples that I'm going to kind of briefly show you. If you want to go to my website, there's some additional support and resources, and we'll come back. Obviously, it's sort of like the book has all of this, sort of like all of this in greater detail. But so if you go back up 1 slide, we've got some examples of, so like if you read the book, right? Like if you want to use the book with your team, this is essentially the plan for how to do that. So it's like, this is what you read, this is what you talk about. This is what you read, you come back the next week, you set aside some time, this is what you talk about. So sort of like, so this is one option, is like, if you're a manager or you're a leader and you actually want to try this out, you've already read the book, here you are, I'm going to just commit, I'm going to do 6 weeks with my team, I'm going to just like have these conversations, and we're going to like just go for it and do it. So that's kind of like, that is an option for you. If you go up 1 more slide. Then we also have just some smaller action steps, right? So all of these are kind of ways that you can initiate an uncomfortable conversation and then give yourself a chance to get better at it with somebody else, right? So you could ask your manager for a copy of your organization's sexual harassment policy. I love starting with that one. The second one that I always do when I'm doing a training, because they will provide me with a copy of the policy. And so then I say, oh, great, can I see your flow chart about how reports are handled? Sometimes they don't have that, right? So simply you ask the question, and then you've like started a conversation about something that needed to happen. I'm just asking a very innocent, practical question, like, oh, could I see that? So sort of thinking the breaking, there's a ton of scenarios in the book that you could just take the one that we had today. The slides are going to be shared with you. So like, here's your scenario about Ray. You can go talk through that scenario with a group of people that, either that you work with or that you don't work with. I'm going to come back. I started a nonprofit organization called The Uncomfortable Conversation. It's a YouTube channel full of videos that you can use to start conversations, because not all workplace appropriate, but you sort of for any area of your life, you absolutely could find something to start a conversation with. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to give people about 7 minutes to go into a group. So all I'm inviting you to do is to think about, like, you listened to me talk about this for 45 minutes. What was the tagline? Is that like, what is said here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here? So it's like, so how is this leaving here? And just think of something some way it's going to leave here. I don't know. You could post about it like on LinkedIn, like, oh, I just went to this really interesting thing. It's like, I don't know. Do something that feels right for you. If you want and you feel moved to share it with somebody else, you can. If you don't want to talk, how is this leaving here? I love that. And so then we'll come back, and if anybody wants to share, they can, but again, no pressure. And then if people come back with any questions or things that they want to share, but we'll do maybe like 7 minutes, and then we'll do kind of just a quick wrap up, and then leave you with some additional resources too. This is the magic moment of joining a breakout room. Everyone is back. right.
Thank you all for coming back and for participating in the breakout rooms. I hope you all shared some really great practical tips and ideas. I know that my mind is going with how to create better habits for myself in these conversations. Before we ask you to share back a little bit of what you spoke about, I do want to address the question that we had in the chat. And if you have others, even if we don't have time to get to them, I'll send them to me and I will get them to Sarah. But we did have one question, which was around, Sarah, if you could talk a little bit about how grooming and very subtle, insidious forms of sexual harassment can be addressed through uncomfortable conversations or through these kinds of habits. How would you go about that?
So one, I love that question. Thank you for asking it. And so I think this is something that we often talk about in the context of effective bystander intervention, right? So I think is one of the challenges and one of the impacts of kind of a habit of silence is that we wait until we see something really overt or definitely wrong before we intervene or speak up, right? And so like part of the skill and the skill around bystander intervention, which uncomfortable conversations can help open up is kind of like opening up the aperture on those types of conversations, because the sooner that you intervene on behalf of safety of the community, the better, right? And so and the less likely that behavior is to kind of move on along the spectrum. And so one way that you can practice that is, using a scenario where you might sort of, again, kind of if it's similar to that Ray scenario. So you want to practice it in a room with a group of colleagues or a group of people in the community, but it's thinking about, you walk by somebody's office and you see something, you see two people in there and one of them sort of looks upset, right? Or it's like, or giving an example of that. You witnessed, I think the person who asked the question about the insidious behavior, like, give me an example of what that behavior is or what that behavior looks like, right? And so somebody witnesses, what might you do? What might you say? Why or why not, right? It sort of starts to create the conversation. So like another example of that would be if you're working with people that, like unpacking policies around social media connections between teachers and students. So it's like understanding why the policy is there, why a boundary is there, right? It's like sort of helps people recognize the importance of those boundaries and why it's important to sort of speak up if you see something. Like making a social media connection with a young person is not necessarily wrong in and of itself, but if it's a pattern of behavior, if you're secretive about it, or if it's a rule and you've broken it, right? Is that's like all of those things kind of add up to they're all opportunities to identify behavior sooner and before it causes harm, right? And so so sort of how do you bring that into like where there might not be a policy against sort of whatever's like the insidious behavior, the sort of more subtle kind of, there might not be a policy against it, but if it's a pattern of behavior, you can't recognize it as a pattern unless people are talking about it, right? So
yeah. I love that you frame it as protecting the community versus just that one individual person that may be experiencing it, right? Speaking up will affect that incident and that person, but also the larger community. Do you want to ask people to share a little bit back of what they?
Yeah. So given that we have like 4 minutes, so I think what I'd love to do is if anybody kind of is walking out of their conversation and they're like, I'm feeling good, I want to just like make sure that I make like my commitment of like the conversation that I'm going to have or the thing I'm going to do next, is I'd love for people to share that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share 2 or 3 more resources, and then I'm going to tell you what my commitment is for 2023 as well. I'm very excited about, and it's going to make it real when I say it. So, all right. So if we go to slide 24. So yes. So just, what can you imagine doing next? And then this is kind of like the part where it's like, how can I help? So we can go to slide 24. So one is you can certainly, the book has a bunch of resources that are available. So kind of it's a longer version of the talk, but it's like at this point you like only buy it for the exercises because you kind of like got the main takeaways from it. If you go to the next slide, so my friend Russ that I told you about, he and I started this YouTube channel called The Uncomfortable Conversation. And we don't do workshops, nothing. All we do is produce videos. There's about 150 videos that are on this YouTube channel, all of which just like encapsulate these uncomfortable conversations with different voices and identities and frameworks and contexts. And it's like, I think it's really fun. The whole idea was like, how do you make talking about sexual violence famous? And viral. So that's like the whole purpose of this channel. So I hope you go there, enjoy it, find something, share it. Great. And then I am also, if you go to the final slide here, I am also available as a resource as well. So you can reach out to me via email. I'm kind of only on like email and Instagram. I guess I'm on LinkedIn, but I didn't include my LinkedIn, but you can certainly find me on LinkedIn as well. But okay, so here's what I will share mine. So we can take the slides down because you can look and see what I look like when I'm not a headshot. Okay, so I have decided, so the last video series that I did last year, for the Uncomfortable Conversation, I did it with this videographer who's also a coach at the gym that I go to. I do CrossFit. And so we did this whole series of videos around uncomfortable conversations in fitness spaces. But just recently, I got connected to this really cool guy. He is probably about my age, in his 40s, male survivor, just starting to kind of like get into doing more speaking and advocacy. And I was just kind of like really inspiring guy, and got me thinking to a lot of the conversations that I had done when I was first getting into this work with male survivors, and thinking about 1 in 6 male survivors, and I've been doing this work with the Phoenix, which is the sober active community, and thinking about the ways that many men take so long to find the healing that they need and deserve because of the different way that shame shows up in their lives, right? So you sort of, there's just higher rates of addiction and mental health and divorce, like all of this. So I want to just do a series about just that centers male survivors, and that kind of just normalizes healing and resilience among that population. And like, I want to just do a series of videos that just illustrate kind of casual, normal, healed male survivors, like walking through the world, like being mentors and awesome people to others. So that's my commitment. I will do that in 2023. But if all you're doing is like writing one thing on LinkedIn, like that is also great. So, oh yeah, we're seeing some. Thank you, Diana. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time.
So
But I will stick around too.
while people continue sharing your commitments, which is so exciting to see, I just want to thank you for taking a time out of your very busy schedules to learn with us today, and also make an ask for you to fill out this very quick, less than 30-second poll that should be on your screen now, to give us a little bit of feedback about today's session, as we're always trying to incorporate learning from you, and we will follow up with the resources as well. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to learning with you again soon. And if you need anything in the meantime, please reach out to SRE.